This is not just another medieval battle. It is the moment an English king bet everything: his crown, his life, his army on one impossible stand. In 1415, Europe was still deep in the Hundred Years' War, a sprawling conflict between England and France that had dragged on for generations. By this time, the English crown had lost most of its continental possessions. Yet the young King Henry V, newly crowned and eager to prove himself, believed the French throne was his by right. In August of that year, Henry crossed the Channel with about 12,000 men. His goal was to take Harfleur, a key port in Normandy, and use it as a base for further campaigns. He did capture the town, but at a terrible cost. Disease ripped through his army. Dysentery and hunger cut his forces to nearly a third of their original strength. With winter coming, Henry decided to march his weakened army north toward the English-held port of Calais, hoping to regroup and return home. But the French nobility was furious at his invasion. They mustered a massive force to intercept him, determined to trap the English before they could escape. By the time Henry reached the small village of Agincourt, his army numbered fewer than 6,000 men, archers, men-at-arms, and a handful of knights. Facing them was a French host at least twice, perhaps 3 times their size. The political stakes could not have been higher. If Henry were captured or killed, the fragile English claim to France would collapse. If the French crushed his army, they could march on Calais and expel the English from the continent. Henry had no choice but to fight. But how could a sick, exhausted army, trapped between a forest and enemy lines, survive the largest French force in decades? Henry's army was small but disciplined. Most were longbowmen, about 5,000 of them, hardened veterans of English campaigns in Wales and Scotland. Each man carried a yew longbow taller than himself, able to shoot a cloth-yard arrow at terrifying speed. The rest were men-at-arms, heavily armored soldiers on foot, including Henry's own knights. Despite weeks of marching, disease, and hunger, morale was steady. Henry, only 29, inspired his men with personal courage and piety. He prayed openly, walked among his troops, and promised them that if they fought bravely, England would remember their names. The French, meanwhile, assembled one of the largest armies of the war. Estimates range from 12,000 to 25,000 men, a glittering mass of nobles, knights, men-at-arms, and a scattering of crossbowmen. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, commanded the host, joined by some of the most powerful dukes in the kingdom. But this army was not united. French nobles argued over strategy and precedence. Some demanded to lead the first attack to claim the greatest share of ransom and glory. Others feared the English longbow and urged caution. Yet all believed victory was certain. After all, they outnumbered the invaders at least 2 to 1. On paper, the French should have annihilated Henry's army. French knights in heavy plate could crush infantry in a head-on charge. They had more cavalry, more men-at-arms, and more supplies. But their reliance on medieval chivalric warfare, massed charges by heavily armored nobles, had already cost them dearly at battles like Crécy and Poitiers. The English longbow had proved devastating against such tactics. Its range and rate of fire could shred charging knights before they reached the line. But this time, the French believed conditions favored them. The English were exhausted, hemmed in by forest on both sides, with little room to retreat. And the battlefield, though narrow, seemed to offer a straight path to crush them. The ground at Agincourt would decide everything. The field lay between 2 patches of dense woodland. It was only about 750 yards across at its widest point, narrowing like a funnel toward the English line. Overnight rain had turned the soil into thick mud. 4 archers on foot, this was an advantage. For armored knights and horses, it would be a nightmare. Henry recognized this instantly. He positioned his army at the narrow end of the field, backed by the woods, forcing the French to attack head-on. His longbowmen planted rows of sharpened stakes in front of their positions to break cavalry charges. Between the stakes and the mud, any French assault would be slowed to a crawl under a storm of arrows. The night before the battle was tense. English soldiers confessed their sins and prepared for what many assumed would be their last fight. Henry walked among his troops, speaking softly to groups of archers and men-at-arms, reminding them of their duty and of God's will. Some chroniclers claim he gave a speech, not the polished words of Shakespeare's play, but a blunt, soldier's appeal to courage and faith. On the French side, nobles feasted and boasted of the ransoms they would demand for captured Englishmen. They expected the battle to be over by midday. Few realized the trap they were marching into. As dawn broke on October 25th, St. Crispin's Day, the field was still cloaked in mist. Henry's archers took their positions, hammering in the last of their stakes. French banners fluttered in the distance as thousands of knights and men-at-arms assembled in 3 great lines. Between the armies stretched a killing ground of mud and rain-soaked earth. No one knew it yet, but by nightfall it would be littered with bodies, broken armor, and snapped lances, the graveyard of French chivalry. Henry gave the order. Drums beat. Arrows were nocked. The Battle of Agincourt was about to begin. At first light, Henry's army stood silent. The French, confident and still forming their lines, hesitated. Hours dragged on. Mud thickened under the steady drizzle. Henry, unwilling to let his men shiver under arrow fire, seized the initiative. He ordered his archers forward, a bold move for an outnumbered army. With disciplined precision they advanced several dozen yards, hammered in their stakes again, and then raised their bows. A single horn blast. The first flight of arrows hissed into the sky. Thousands of shafts darkened the morning and slammed into the French vanguard. Horses screamed. Men went down. French pride turned to rage. Stung, the French knights spurred forward. Their heavy destriers sank knee-deep in the sludge. Armored men-at-arms, forced into a bottleneck by the woods on either side, tripped over one another. The longbow storm intensified. In less than a minute each English archer could loose 6 arrows, a deadly hail of iron-tipped shafts ripping through plate, puncturing joints, skewering unarmored horses. The first wave never reached the stakes intact. Some knights tried to wheel left or right, only to be crushed by comrades behind. Others dismounted and slogged forward on foot, shields raised. By the time they reached the English line, they were exhausted, mud-covered, and wounded. Waiting for them were Henry's men-at-arms and archers with mallets, swords, and daggers. What should have been a triumphant breakthrough became a slaughter in the muck. Behind the chaos, the second French line pressed forward, unaware of the carnage ahead. They crashed into the retreating remnants of the first wave. Horses stumbled over bodies. The crush became so tight that knights could hardly lift their arms to swing swords. Chroniclers describe men suffocating under the press of their own comrades. All the while, English arrows poured in without pause. Henry himself fought in the front rank. He was struck by an axe that cracked his helmet but kept fighting, rallying his men. This was no distant king commanding from a hill. He was shoulder to shoulder with common archers in the killing ground. The real killer at Agincourt was not only the longbow but the mud. Heavy rain and churned soil turned the battlefield into a quagmire. Each armored Frenchman weighed well over 50 kilograms more with steel and gear. Once knocked down, many could not rise. Archers swarmed over fallen knights, using daggers to finish them, taking prisoners only when possible. What began as chivalric combat dissolved into brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Seeing the disaster ahead, parts of the French third line hesitated. Commanders shouted orders, but confusion reigned. Some tried to flank through the woods, only to be ambushed by archers. Others simply fled. In less than 3 hours, one of the largest armies France had assembled lay wrecked in front of a force half its size. Mid-battle, a small French detachment slipped around and raided the English baggage train at the rear, capturing supplies and slaughtering servants. Fearing a larger attack and unable to spare men to guard prisoners, Henry made a grim decision. He ordered many of the captured French nobles killed on the spot to prevent an uprising behind his line. Chroniclers recorded the shock among his men, but the order was obeyed. It was one more sign of how desperate the fight truly was. By midday, the surviving French broke. Some tried to surrender, others to flee. The once glittering banners lay trampled in the mud. The English archers, exhausted but relentless, pushed forward across heaps of bodies. When the horns finally sounded for retreat, the battlefield had become a swamp of corpses, wrecked armor, and abandoned standards. the pride of France buried under rain and blood. The scale of French losses was staggering. Out of perhaps 12,000 to 20,000 men, thousands lay dead, including the Constable of France, 3 dukes, 5 counts, and over 100 knights of noble birth. English losses were astonishingly light by comparison, perhaps a few hundred. The flower of French chivalry had been cut down in a single morning. Henry's army, though too weak to press deeper into France, had won one of the most lopsided victories in medieval history. The prisoners taken, among them high-ranking nobles worth enormous ransoms, would help fund England's war effort for years. More than a military triumph, Agincourt was a psychological earthquake. Once again, as at Crécy and Poitiers, a smaller English force had annihilated a larger French host. But this time the disparity was even greater. French reliance on heavy cavalry and noble charges looked obsolete in the face of disciplined infantry and the longbow. For the English, Agincourt became a national myth almost overnight, proof of divine favor and the courage of common soldiers alongside their king. Chroniclers back home spread tales of miraculous victory. It bolstered Henry's claim to the French throne and strengthened his hold on the English crown. 4 years later, Henry returned to France with a larger army and forced the Treaty of Troyes, which recognized him as heir to the French throne and regent of France. Though his early death and the rise of Joan of Arc would later undo much of this, Agincourt marked the high-water mark of English power on the continent. For the French, the defeat spurred gradual reforms. They began to rely less on feudal levies and more on paid, disciplined troops, setting the stage for the professional armies of the later 15th century. On a muddy field near a small village in northern France, a young king bet everything and won. The Battle of Agincourt was not just a clash of armies. It was a turning point in how wars were fought and remembered. Outnumbered, sick, and exhausted, Henry's soldiers carved their story into history, a story retold for centuries as the triumph of discipline and ingenuity over pride and numbers. Today, the fields around Agincourt are quiet farmland, but beneath the soil still lie traces of that October morning when longbowmen changed the course of a war and a king's gamble reshaped 2 nations. If you found this story gripping, there are many more hidden chapters of history waiting. Stay tuned, subscribe, and join us as we uncover the forgotten wars that shaped our world.